what the hell? Let's do it.
That's the spirit. To quote the great Joseph Campbell, he said, "It is by going down into the abyss where we recover the treasures of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure." To the ironic twist of the unknown. Bottoms up.
Cheers.
Cheers.
To the ironic twist of the unknown. Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome everybody to Aeon Bite and Happy New Year. Happy 2025. Here we are in January on a Mars day. My name is Miguel Connor and I am your host and Pompatus of Gnosis, and I am very excited for today's show. In fact, I already see in the chat people are doing their best Rod Serling impersonations on the YouTube chat because it's automatic. My favorite one, which I've used in the show, is "We will not end the nightmare. We will only explain the nightmare." So we all have it. But with us, very excited about this show. Long overdue, a very Gnostic, surreal, mystic themed show. And that is the Twilight Zone. And with us to take us on this journey, on this surreal journey, it is a pleasure to have Arlen Schumer, who will be discussing his new book, The 5 Themes of the Twilight Zone. Arlen, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you for having me, Miguel. I'm so excited to talk about the Twilight Zone and everything your show's about and how they intertwine.
Yeah, and this show, as we're going to find out, is very relevant, and you've mentioned it in your book and many of your presentations you're giving. It's in this age of social media and post-truth and all that, it's probably more relevant than ever. And
Absolutely,
it took us here.
Yeah, I mean, I did a webinar a couple years ago when the pandemic hit called Twilight Zone in the Age of Corona, and how so many of the episodes are about isolation, about separation from reality, abandoned cities, all the sheltering in place, all the things we were going through that these Twilight Zone episodes evoked. And that's because Rod Serling was a visionary, a true visionary who, you know, was not only of his time, but timeless, which is the definition of art itself.
Oh, indeed. A genius. Somebody I put up there. We've been on email. I put him on the same label as Jack Kirby, Philip K. Dick, William Burroughs. Somebody who saw the reality behind reality and prophesied what our age is going to be, our, internet nuclear age.
Exactly. I mean, even the word paranormal, which means, above and beyond reality. Well, that's what the Twilight Zone was, which is what Surrealism was. The word surreal, it's French. It means on top of reality. The original Surrealists in the early 1929, they wanted people to step back from their reality and look at it fresh. If they could look at a crystal ball and see into the future and saw the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, they would have accepted him as a true Surrealist, except he put it on television. It was surreal. People describe the Twilight Zone, it was a science fiction show. Well, yeah, the bulk of the episodes were. And Serling employed some of the greatest science fiction writers of the 20th century, Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, George Clayton Johnson, among others. But the thing is that it was also, people say, it was a horror show. Yeah, there were some of those shock endings that were truly horror invoking. Or some people say it was a fantasy show. Well, it was grounded in a reality far more real and true for both its day and ours. The Twilight Zone, above all those things, was surreal. It was surrealism on television. All of those episodes are about, when you hum the Twilight Zone theme music, when something weird happens in your life, you're invoking a surrealist experience. You've stepped back from your reality, paranormal, and looked at it fresh. And that's what the greatest Twilight Zone episodes do, is that the characters go through that. And by extension, ourselves as the audience watching the show, we become those characters. And that's why we can relate the Twilight Zone to our own lives, because we've all had those surrealist moments where we go do 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 do. That's what unites it all.
Well said indeed. And with us, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing?
Oh, I got cold hands and a warm heart, just like Captain Kirk.
I was complimenting Vance on the great background of the concentric circles of the Twilight Zone, which, like so many of the graphics of the Twilight Zone, had antecedents in the Surrealism graphics, but they were also ahead of their time. Like that Twilight Zone vortex was ahead of op art, which emerged a couple of years later. And that's the great thing about the Twilight Zone graphics. So Vance, thumbs up.
Hey, my pleasure, sir.
What respect? What did I do to deserve such respect?
Arlen.
Well, yeah, for the audience, I see a good group today. I see the usual suspects: H.P. Lovecraft, Graham Pong, Black Eagle.
H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah, he's here. He's got a.
Let me quote something. Stephen King, in a 1983 book he wrote, a nonfiction overview of the science fiction, fantasy, and horror fields called Dance Macabre. Do you know that book?
Yeah.
He devotes a chapter to the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
And in it, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, Serling and the Twilight Zone lit the sparks of our imaginations. And like nobody since H.P. Lovecraft, Serling showed a new way. And in doing so, opened up a door of possibilities to him and his generation. The Steven Spielbergs, the George Lucases, the David Lynch's,
Jordan Peele,
basically
younger generation directors.
Their descendants, meaning the creators of our modern fantasy, science fiction, and horror worlds. I can trace back to the Twilight Zone in less than 6 degrees of Rod Serling, and I'm punning on Kevin Bacon, if you know that 6 degrees. But the thing is, Serling didn't invent science fiction. Serling didn't invent robots or people who think they're mannequins or any of those things. But he perfected them on the medium of television at a time when film television, especially anthology style, not continuing characters every week like every sitcom, but even dramatic show, but anthology in only a half hour. In those 25 minutes, Serling and company were able to touch upon the deepest psychological, philosophical, paranormal concepts that philosophers and intellectuals have been debating for literally thousands of years. And through the medium of 20th century science fiction that Serling was a fan of, all those writers like Matheson and Beaumont, what he did was he brought serious science fiction to American television in a half-hour form that he so perfected with those surprise endings. Alfred Hitchcock had surprise endings. O. Henry wrote about surprise endings, but Serling perfected them for television. We still talk about those surprise endings like the pig faces, Eye of the Beholder. If you saw that when you were a kid, that burned its way into your brain forever.
Forever.
We don't talk about surprise endings they offered Hitchcock. I mean, maybe Hitchcock fans do, but my point is, Serling perfected these things for television. And in doing so, there was never anything like the Twilight Zone before it, and there was never really been anything like it since. No more anthology drama, no more half-hour anthology drama. Everything shifted to 1 hour. But those half-hour episodes, if aliens beamed down right now in my apartment and said, Arlen, we have room on our spaceship for one Earth television show, what are you going to give them, guys? Are you going to give them The Sopranos? Are you going to give them Seinfeld? Are you going to give them, I Love... No. I'm giving them the Twilight Zone, specifically the episodes in my book that I chose to write about, 68 out of 156.
No.
Because, my feeling was I'm very critical about the things I love. I'm a comic book historian, I'm an historian of Bruce Springsteen's music, but I'm as critical of those works as I am laudatory, as all fans, quote unquote, critics, historians should be. And in other fields, that's what they do. They create consensuses of what is best. I forgive over half of the Twilight Zone episodes, I think, are dogs. Now, there's various degree of dog, but I forgive those because churning out weekly half-hour anthology television where you didn't have the same sets or characters every week. You had to create a whole new world every week on a tight budget. So, yeah, they had a lot of duds, but you want to know something? I compare it to baseball, percentages. 68 out of 156 is like batting 435. That ain't bad. No. Serling wrote the bulk of the episodes, I think 92 or 3 out of 156. Out of the 68 episodes, 41, I think, are his. So 41 out of 92 is like batting 460 something. So that's how I grade the Twilight Zone. And, these were episodes that I felt compelled to write about. And that's how I both judged it, by my emotional connection to them and my intellectual connection to them. What they said, what they spoke of, what they hinted at, what the plot was about, the performances of the actors. Every episode is like a little world. And I like to think that if you read these essays that I've written about them, and the way I've grouped them into the 5 themes, to say that even though Serling had other writers and directors and actors, it's kind of like Orson Welles with the Mercury Theater in a way. Serling was the auteur, just like Orson Welles was. And I broke it up into 5 themes: science and superstition, suburban nightmares, a question of identity, obsolete man, and the time, I forgot my own theme, the time element. Anyway, within each theme, those were, I think, Serling's broadest themes that all of the other writers consciously or subconsciously wrote to. So the 68 episodes are broken up into those 5 themes, and I've arranged each theme chronologically so that you get a sense of how that theme developed over the 5-year run. But if I've done my job as the writer, even the most ardent aficionado of the Twilight Zone, and there are plenty out there, they might think they know these episodes just like I do. I've seen them 1,000 times. If I've done my job, maybe they're going to glean something, and they might think about something. They might learn something. They might see that episode differently, and I'm counting on it because of the way I wrote these essays. They're almost like stream of consciousness reflections. In other words, they're not just plot synopses. I mean, you can go on Wikipedia and get plot synopses, and every other book about the Twilight Zone, has plot synopses. Sometimes, if the essay calls for it, if the episode calls, I do relate my essay almost chronologically following the plot of the episode. Other times, I'll reveal the so-called surprise ending right up front, because so many of these surprise endings have become pop culture lore. Burgess Meredith breaking his glasses at the end of Time Enough at Last. To Serve Man, it's a cookbook.
It's a cookbook.
These are things that have become, part of our, again, the Twilight Zone influence is so pervasive that it's almost invisible. But again, through my essays, as the episode went on, if it suggested a relation to something in the wider popular culture, past, present, fine art, commercial art, all the things that have influenced me growing up, in the 60s and 70s, and all the American pop culture I ingested, reflected back in these Twilight Zone episodes.
Yeah, it's a great read. Highly recommended, and I learned so much. But why don't we talk before we get into the 5 themes, Arlen, we should probably discuss the man himself, Mr. Sterling, as again
Sterling!
emailing you.
Sterling! Oh, security! How dare you? Do you know how many people call him Sterling?
Yeah, sometimes
Sterling with a T.
Oh, God damn it!
Oh.
Okay, we'll edit that out later, Vance.
Yeah. Or maybe I'll be
I can't even go on. I gotta. Okay. And we're back.
And we're back. Yes. I am in an episode.
That's all right. They
Twilight
screwed up Robbie the robot in that one episode, so that makes up for what.
Listen, professional writers that have written about the Twilight Zone, articles I've seen online, sometimes they don't even catch it, and they call him Sterling. I'm saying it's just a classic,
It happens.
Yeah, but it is Sterling.
Let's hope there's not. Yeah, somebody said there's not a Mandela effect with it. You never know. But
yeah, because anyway. You know why Sterling is so common and Serling was so uncommon.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only been, there's one Rod Serling. That was it.
That's it. But as we were emailing, he reminded me a little bit of Jack Kirby. Same. Working class Jewish fellow goes to World War II. Let me quote H.P. Lovecraft. Sees man-made horrors beyond imagination.
Like a whole generation coming out of
back, and something is open. Something is
Norman Mailer, J.D. Salinger. That whole generation either kept it inside, like a whole, so many of them did of the greatest generation, but others who were artistic leaning cathartically channeled it through their writing, their artwork, whatever. But yeah, Serling comes out of the World War II.
And of course, he comes to this world of nuclear warfare, mass media, shadowy empire. I mean,
and the new
world had changed.
And the new medium of television at the same time.
Yeah, everything. The world had changed like never before. And
right.
Serling is really able to tap into this.
Did you say Sterling again?
No, I said Serling this time.
We'll check that, Vance.
Yeah.
Roll the videotape.
Yeah, we don't want to get Sterling now.
Yeah. I thought I heard Sterling.
But that's what made Serling, right? That's it. And of course, he became very successful in TV anyway.
He was the right man at the right time. He transitioned from radio to television, in the post-war era in the 1950s. He made his bones in live television coming out of New York City, where he won 3 Emmys in a row in 56, 7, and 8. And, Requiem for a Heavyweight, things like that. Those 3 Emmys gave him the creative clout to go out to Los Angeles to do the Twilight Zone, just as live television in New York died out because it was too expensive, not enough ratings, and television switched to film series on the West Coast. Just like the Dodgers and Giants moving out of New York in the late 50s, was the move to Los Angeles. So Serling was thrust into this medium of film television, but he had come out of the live things that won him those Emmys that, were socially conscious stories that he would later turn into Twilight Zone episodes. Themes like Obsolete Man. His first Emmy was for Patterns, which is about the older executive being, shoved aside for the younger, younger ad exec coming in. This whole post-war, man in the gray flannel suit, American businessman, that whole milieu, if you call it, Serling reflected from coming out of that era and writing about it and turning it into Twilight Zone episodes, like A Stop at Willoughby, about the ad man who can't take it anymore and fantasizes.
Willoughby.
Yeah. Willoughby. Next stop, Willoughby. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, and also I think you mentioned it was one of your talks, you talked about how he was still in Europe and his father passed away. He couldn't even go to the funeral. I mean, so he was pretty traumatized. Yeah.
Now, for a Jewish son not to be able to bury his father is such a shanda, such a shame. But there was a lot of anti-Semitism in World War II that's not as discussed as it, there was black, segregation in World War II, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And I wouldn't be surprised if Serling was not allowed to go to his father's funeral because of anti-Semitism in, the American hierarchy itself. That's a whole nother story for another time, right?
Yeah, but it was a changing time.
Reflected it all. He couldn't say the word Jews in these Twilight Zone episodes, but he had one called "He's Alive" with Dennis Hopper as a neo-Nazi.
Yeah,
torn from today's headlines, but it's the great Dennis Hopper. And he's talking about when they let foreigners in. Well, foreigners was code word for Jews in those days.
The Irish.
Censors were,
Could have been the Irish.
That was a generation before.
Oh, yeah, you're right. That was in the 20s.
But I'm just saying, there were episodes about concentration camps in the Twilight Zone called Death's Head Revisited. And even there, Serling couldn't have the word Jew in it. But, you didn't need to be, a linguist to read between the lines. So that's the way Serling got these timeless, socially conscious themes and ideas into half-hour television that influenced a whole generation, and especially, like I said, our generation of modern fantasy, science fiction, horror, you name it, are all Serling's metaphorical children. He died 50 years ago this year. His centennial was actually last year. But Serling died in 75. If you think about 1975, Spielberg's Jaws came out that year. Stephen King's Carrie came out that year. Serling's metaphorical children were just coming to the fore when he died. He died, unfortunately, I think, thinking he didn't succeed. He didn't think the Twilight Zone was any big deal. He said, yeah, we had some turkeys. We had some episodes I'm proud to be a part of. But he didn't write the great American novel. He didn't write the great American stage play like one of his heroes, Arthur Miller. Serling only wanted to be remembered as a writer. And yet, when you see when he died in 75, if he had only lived 5 or 10 years longer, he was only 50 years old, and he died of smoking all those cigarettes. But if he had lived 5 or 10 years longer, he would have seen the full flower of his influence from the Twilight Zone on, Spielberg, Lucas, everything that has come since. And then he would have known how the Twilight Zone was so influential. And in a sense, my father died when I was 4 months old. My mother raised my brother and I, my older brother, by herself. And I think I sought my father figures in the American pop culture I grew up with, the superheroes and the comic books I was reading. Serling himself was like a father figure. Eventually, Bruce Springsteen was a kind of father figure. I worked for my childhood idol, one of the great comic book artists of all time, named Neil Adams. He was like a father figure. I think in terms of what I've done for the Twilight Zone, in terms of my books, my original book about the Twilight Zone, Coffee Table Art book, came out in 1990 from Chronicle Books. And it's, about, treating the photography and the images like art photography. I can never find a good example. And the dialogue and narration like poetry. And that's why I always thought of the Twilight Zone as this beautiful body of artwork. By the way, when you take off the dust jacket.
Oh, wow.
That's the first image I can recall seeing as a child. I must have been 4.5 years old in front of my black and white television set. So 32 years later, I end up doing a coffee table art book. So, gee, I became an artist. What a surprise, right? But yeah, so I think what I've done with, my books, my lectures about the Twilight Zone, so much of which is right on my website on the Twilight Zone subpage, are almost like what I imagine the way a son would treat his father's works. I've honored Serling's work with what I've done, and I'm especially most proud of this. that I finally got down for posterity, treating these Twilight Zone episodes as the works of art that they are in book form. I've treated him as my metaphorical father in his honor, and keeping his works and indirectly my works alive through the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, keep that flame going because it's so influential. I mean, I think one of your talks, you point out how it influenced even some of the great classics of our time, some of the Gnostic classics, like let me read the list. Jacob's Ladder, one of my all-time favorite movies, is based on occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge.
Yep.
Truman Show, based off of A World of Different. Shadow Play influenced The Matrix, Vanilla Sky, and Inception. Let's see, and there's a few. Oh, The Lonely influenced Westworld, another Gnostic show, and of course, most people know I Shot an Arrow into the Air is,
Most
Planet
people
of the
don't
Apes.
know. They don't know.
Oh, they don't know this. Oh, okay,
Most
yes, it has the
people
same
not-
ending, people, as the
Believe
Planet of
me.
the Apes.
Most people do not. This is what I'm saying about the Twilight Zone's influence. It's so pervasive that it's almost invisible.
Mhm.
And there are people, I'm telling you, if you pick 10 people off the street right now, I guarantee you, I'm going to say no more than 2 people might know that. And I think I'm being generous.
Yeah, but everybody knows the ending of Planet of the Apes. 8 people would know the
See,
ending.
that's my point.
Mhm.
People don't know that Serling co-wrote. It's funny. I compare that ending, Planet of the Apes, and that's one of the greatest movie endings of all time. As great as Orson Welles' Rosebud. I mean, those are the 2 like Mount Rushmores of movie endings. Yes. And yet Serling took it from a Twilight Zone episode that he had done, 30 years earlier. Not 30, what am I saying? 8 years earlier.
Yeah.
But even that episode, and this is what people still don't know, unless you're a Twilight Zone aficionado, Serling got the idea for that episode at a cocktail party in Hollywood. It had to be sometime after the Twilight Zone debuted in the fall of '59. And they were talking about the new space program. If you read The Right Stuff or saw the movie, 1959 was the second year of the, Mercury astronauts, right? So everybody was talking about the space race and Russia, and right? And a woman named Madeline Champion says, I bet you that if astronauts crash landed in the middle of the Mojave Desert, they would think they were on another planet. Serling took out his wallet and took out $500 and paid her right there on the spot for the idea, and turned it into the 1960 episode. In the spring, I think it aired, I Shot an Arrow into the Air. So that's the sort of chain of events. So technically, and she gets credit at the end of the episode based on an idea by Madeline Champion. So, but listen, that's how artists work. They take things from real life. I think Ringo was in a cab and the driver was complaining about how hard he was working. And he goes, "Yeah, I'm working 8 days a week." So,
the rest is history.
The rest is history, right? But it's true. True artists allow their reality to seep into their work. I think it was Werner Herzog maybe who said, there's the movie you set out to make, and then there's the movie you end up making. Mm-hmm. And that's really true for any work of art, that you should allow, a real artist allows real life to seep in to the art, because that's the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. It's part of, but you see, true art is, again, both of its time and timeless. And that's the definition of art. That's why we always have to wait X number of years before we can really judge whether something is a timeless work of art.
Well said. What about you, Vance? Do you have a question, or do you have a favorite Twilight Zone episode, or one that you really like?
Let's see. It's hard to pick a favorite, but
you can. It's like picking your favorite kid. Although maybe some parents, you know what I mean. It's like I might have a top 5, but I got to tell you, you have to have at least a top 10. There's so many great episodes.
Oh yeah.
Once even you get to 10 and you go, oh, how can I leave this one out? And
how about the one with the Martians? Archie Bunker. They kept on screwing around with time. I don't remember the title of that. Where the Martians in the hotel. They had this weird. They were hiding. They were watching people and then they were reeling them back and forth. Who's I
don't think you're describing a Twilight Zone episode.
I think that was, but
what are you talking about? Well, describe it again.
They're Martians were there. They were Martians, and they had some sort of little device, and they kept on aiming at people and wheeling them back and forth through time.
No, that's not a Twilight Zone episode.
I don't know maybe it was an Outer Limits, but
can I tell you something? In all the years I've been lecturing on the Twilight Zone, people describe episodes that it turns out are not Twilight Zone, but that's because Twilight Zone became the kind of brand name for all the somewhat similar shows of that era. One Step Beyond, Outer Limits, whatever. There are some other vague shows that were around that had science fiction, fantasy elements. People describe episodes that are Alfred Hitchcock episodes thinking they're Twilight Zone. So that's what I find kind of amusing, that the first thing you thought of, Vance, if you were to name your favorite episode, it turns out wasn't even a Twilight Zone episode. So do you have a favorite Twilight Zone episode?
Well, I don't have a favorite, but I like the one where she went, where all the people wind up to be ugly and she was beautiful. She's the only beautiful one.
Eye the Beholder. Yeah. That used to be always number one in most Twilight Zone polls that I've seen over the years or decades. But in their intervening years, To Serve Man usually ranks even higher, or
it always pops up
last. But you see, both of those, To Serve Man, while I admire the episode, I wrote about it in my book. It's what I call a punchline episode.
Yeah.
It's really a pun. I mean, it's a cute pun, but people remember that pun aspect of it. It's not in my top 25. I mean, it made my top 68 because I had something to say about it.
There's lurch in it, you got.
But and the other episode you mentioned, what was the other episode?
Well, before the show, I mentioned my favorites was The Hunt, Good Life, The Howling Man, because it's those are very.
The Howling Man by Charles Beaumont is all about the devil.
Yeah.
And it personifies the devil in the most classic way with the horns and the pitchfork and the cape at the end of the episode.
Yeah, I love those.
And it's the most gothic of all the Twilight Zone episodes. It's got the castle and the lightning and the thunder and the tilted angles. Directed by the same director that did Eye of the Beholder, the Pig Faces episode.
Yeah, and the one with Kirk at the diner. Everybody's got to love that. The
devil head. The devil head, yeah.
And Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. Of course.
Yeah, that's a classic.
Both written by Richard Matheson.
Yeah. I love anyone. Almost all the entire Star Trek original show cast appeared in Twilight Zone at one point.
Absolutely. You've got Nimoy, Kay is in a very little scene episode. Very interesting in its own way. Serling was the first to have. Listen, Roddenberry delivered the eulogy at Serling's funeral in 1975 when he died. And again, to paraphrase the eulogy, he basically said Star Trek would have only been a glimmer in my eye if it hadn't been for what Serling did with the Twilight Zone and the doors that he opened. And, Serling did diversity casting before the phrase obviously was coined, but Serling cast the first black man in a dramatic role in a 1960 episode. The Big Tall Wish. Mm-hmm. He cast women in serious dramatic roles as single independent women. Serling had 2 daughters of his own, and that might have influenced that. But again, he treated women as individuals. One episode is about a woman artist living in New York City. I mean, you think in 1961 American television, there was a dramatic show about a female artist living in New York City?
Yeah.
That's the same year Bob Dylan came to New York, by the way. So Serling is giving us a vision. So he's casting independent women, black actors, more than just background characters that anybody else might have been doing. So Serling influenced that aspect of Star Trek. Matheson, George Clayton Johnson wrote the very first Trek episode. I think the very first great episode of Star Trek was Matheson's episode where Kirk splits into two, which was like the 5th episode.
Oh, yeah, like that one.
The Enemy Within, is that what
That
it's
dog.
called? Right?
Yeah. It's got a dog in it. Little horn.
So my point is, again, in the lectures I do about the Twilight Zone or the webinars where I show its influence on American television, films, modern pop art, modern art, popular culture, I go through these things and I show the influence of the Twilight Zone on both movies and on television shows that followed it. Beginning with Outer Limits, which again, when you said, Vance, it might have been Outer Limits episode. Everybody recalls those fondly. But, they were all 1 hour. I thought they were padded to fit the hour. Even when Twilight Zone for one season went to 1 hour, out of the 18 1-hour episodes, I think I write about 3 of them. Most of them are padded to fill the hour. But so were the Alfred Hitchcock episodes when they switched to an hour. There's something about that half-hour form for anthology television that just worked better than the 1 hour form. If I could afford it, I would hire a professional television editor to take all those Outer Limits episodes, edit them down to a half hour. I guarantee you they'd be more watchable than they are now. But there's never been anything like the Twilight Zone ever since. I mean,
what about Chris Carter and the X-Files?
Okay, again, there are spin-offs of the Twilight Zone. The idea of whatever you would consider the X-Files, and they had a broad range of stories. But face it, Chris Carter is another one of Serling's metaphorical children.
Oh, yeah.
I think one of the episodes has Mulder talking about the episode that influenced him the most. He's talking about the Twilight Zone. And I think Carter wrote that episode, and it's basically Carter talking about how the Twilight Zone influenced him, which backs up what Stephen King said in Dance Macabre. So yeah, there are shows like the X-Files. The best sort of Twilight Zone influencee has been Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror coming out of England.
Of course.
Because it's technology run amok. So there's a general theme, and all the episodes sort of fit into that theme, but they all come out of a single consciousness, which is his. He doesn't write all the episodes, but, they reflect his worldview. All the other knockoffs of the Twilight Zone didn't have that. That's why they all suck, in my opinion. The only thing, like I said, it's either do it well in your own sandbox, like Chris Carter did with the X-Files. And, Vince Gilligan, who came out of the X-Files, and then he does Breaking Bad. And when Breaking Bad ended, I remember he was interviewed in TV Guide, and they said, now that you've finished Breaking Bad, and critics are calling it one of the greatest TV shows of all time, how do you want to be remembered? And he said, and again, I'm paraphrasing, if my show can be remembered in the future the way we talk about the Twilight Zone today, I'll be a happy boy. So that just shows you, again, the influence of the ongoing influence of the Twilight Zone.
Oh, yeah, it is eternal. And Arlen, what would you say? How would you define the Twilight Zone, or where did Serling read any esoteric books or treatise? I mean, what is the Twilight Zone, if somebody has to ask?
Okay,
you?
so
Not a show, but the concept.
Okay, so in 1924, the French poet André Breton created the movement of Surrealism. It started out as a literary movement. They wanted people to write and drift off into a kind of a state of unconsciousness and do what they called automatic writing, or what we would call stream of consciousness writing. And so that's how Surrealism started, as a literary movement. But because the poets hung out with the artists, it eventually became a visual movement with Salvador Dali, et cetera, et cetera. And it became, to this day, one of the most famous art movements, most popular. And last year was its 100th anniversary, its centennial of that first. Breton wrote a manifesto, and I'm going to try to quote it by word. Everything leads us to believe that there exists a spot in the mind where past and future, oh man, I got to quote it. It's right here in my book. I don't want to mess up the quote.
No problem.
I won't be able to find. Between past and future, high and low, the communicable and the incommunicable will cease to appear contradictory. What does Serling introduce the Twilight Zone with? There's a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is the dimension between science and superstition, between shadow and substance. And it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone. So what Breton called the spot in the mind, where all these contradictory things coexist, a third reality on top of reality. You know, nothing is truly original. Anything original that laymen call original is really taking things that have never been pre-existing things that have never been properly introduced. I call it the Reese's Peanut Butter School of Creation. Chocolate existed, peanut butter existed, but Reese brought them together, created Reese's. But truly, Surrealism said in another one of Breton's manifestos, Surrealism is like the unexpected meeting on a dissection table between an umbrella and a sewing machine. Now, whatever you might think that even means, what he was basically saying was when you bring two things together that are two distinct realities, and when you bring them together, they create a third reality. 1 + 1 = 3.
Right.
You create a new reality. So that's not only the definition of surrealism, it's the definition of all creation, is taking pre-existing elements and bringing them together. The X factor is your individual soul that you inject into that chemical combination. So that's, to me, the definition of art. So that is why, that is the definition of the Twilight Zone. The dimension of imagination. Just think about the possibility. It's sight, sound, and mind. It's involving all of the senses and injecting it into your inner self, your imagination. You know, again, physicists, theologians, we're still debating what is reality.
Yeah.
Now, the latest articles are saying reality only exists because we observe it. Or I'm taking things I see on, Facebook or whatever, but it's also in the New York Times, right?
Right.
My point is, we're still talking about the nature of reality or paranormal reality. And the Twilight Zone is basically showing us examples of those questions, not necessarily giving the answers, but presenting the questions of what is reality. One of the episodes you mentioned, The Truman Show, the movie, Jim Carrey wakes up one day and, his whole world is a manufactured fake world. Everything's fake. Everything is well, gee, haven't we all thought about that our own lives every now and then, right?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
It is what philosophers have been debating. Do we live in a malevolent world or a benevolent one? Is there predestiny? If you believe in, God has a plan for us and, I know your past and I know your future. Do we have free will then? Are we just acting out a script? So Richard Matheson, his greatest episode, in my opinion, 1960, A World of Difference, is about an actor no, it's not about an actor. It's about a businessman who goes to make a phone call in his office and the line is dead. And he gets up to go to his secretary outside to tell her about the problem. And he hears somebody yell, "Cut." And he turns and there's a whole movie crew there filming his life. Okay. So that's Richard Matheson's concept, right? He's a businessman who's all of a sudden his life has become a movie.
Oh my God, yeah.
To the movie crew, he's an actor, an alcoholic actor who's gone off his nut and believes he's the role he's playing in the movie they're filming about a businessman. So again, in 25 minutes, Matheson and by extension Serling, are presenting this philosophical, deeply meaningful paradox about life itself. If you really think about it, what is the real reality? Are we living, again, do we have predestiny? Are we acting on a script? Do we have free will? Are we playing a role? What is our authentic self? I mean, the list
in
goes
Plato's
on.
cave. Are we in the Matrix?
My point is, as teaching tools, again, while not sacrificing any dramatic narrative, what's great about these episodes, if you're teaching storytelling to, let's say, young directors in film school, these are primers on terse, pungent, tight storytelling. The best episodes suck you in the first 30 seconds to a situation. A woman is at a bus station, and she sees herself in the mirror, in the bus station. That happens in the first 5 minutes. And I mean, it sucks you into this nightmare world all of a sudden. Where are there duplicates? Haven't we all thought we saw somebody that looked just like us? And I mean, this is something, again, science fiction writers wrote about in those pulp novels that only science fiction fans read. The reason why the 50s had all those giant monster movies or science fiction movies with giant ants and stuff was because they weren't adapting, by and large, the great science fiction short stories, because science fiction literature was considered junk. And it was only read by a small, coterie of fans.
Same with comic books.
All from Southern California. My point is, Serling took those great stories and treated them seriously and adapted them for television. The art of adaptation, Serling was a master of. Some of the greatest episodes are not Serling originals. They're adaptations. Time Enough at Last. Why do people remember that episode? Because of the cruelty of the ending. We had come as an audience to sympathize with Burgess Meredith's character. He was likable. He had that horrible wife that ripped up his poetry book. We fell in love with Henry Bemis, and then he finally got redemption. He had time enough at last to read all his library books. And then he breaks his glasses. Now, if you know anything about Serling, though he had seen the horrors of death, he had a positive worldview. But you see, this was an adaptation of a woman named Lynn Venable. And that was her ending. And the thing is, that's a very negative ending. That's a very pessimistic ending. The idea that a likable character, and it almost violates the unspoken rules of storyteller and audience. How dare you make us fall in love with a character and then play a merciless trick on him? And yet, that's why the episode is remembered, for the cruelty of the ending. I believe, had it been a Serling original, it would have ended with a crane shot pull away of Bemis reading his books with the, fade out to black at the end. But
he could have gone to an optometrist's office and gotten rid of those, variable things that they had.
Yeah, how everybody would fix Time Enough at Last. But all I'm saying is the two episodes more remembered than Eye of the Beholder is a pun episode, To Serve Man, and a cruel episode that was a Serling adaptation. And by the way, so was To Serve Man. That was an adaptation of a story by Damon Knight from 1950. So again, some of the fondest remembered Twilight Zone episodes are, I think, out of the 41 of the 68 episodes in my book that are written by Serling, a dozen of them are adaptations. And those dozen, again, are some of the most popular Twilight Zone episodes. This is why they give Oscars to best adapted screenplay, because adapting is an art form in itself. And Serling was an underrated master of adapting short stories into Twilight Zone episodes.
And of course, like you said, To Serve Man has been adapted in other stories like V. We've had
Of
two
course.
iterations of V,
Of-
famous classic science.
Again, this is where you get the 6 degrees of Serling. It all comes back to the Twilight Zone. Again, in my lectures, I touch upon all of these. Like I said, the list goes on, but I picked the best sort of influences. I've got a whole film program designed called the Twilight Zone episodes and the movies they inspired. And it's that whole list, that I show the influence. I'm having a screening in New York City on January 30th where I team Serling's favorite episode, A Stop at Willoughby, with the cult classic movie The Swimmer from 1968, starring Burt Reynolds in a role he considered his greatest, by the way. Have you ever seen The Swimmer, either of you?
Long time ago.
Do you remember?
A little bit.
Okay, I'll take that you didn't see it. I don't buy that you saw it and you don't remember it. The Swimmer is so memorable. It's one of the greatest films of the 60s. It's become a cult classic. But why am I pairing it with A Stop at Willoughby? A Stop at Willoughby was about a harried ad exec who can't take it anymore, jumps off the train and kills himself. But in his dreams, he's off in Willoughby, this idyllic 19th century town that represents his escape from the rat race. Well, The Swimmer is about an ex-ad man who decides one day, he's middle-aged, he's going to swim across the county via his neighbor's swimming pools. Now, it's based on a 1964 John Cheever short story. Cheever, famous for writing about the dark underbelly of suburbia. Again, that's part of what was the Twilight Zone. David Lynch with Blue Velvet, the dark underbelly of suburbia. Serling was doing that on the Twilight Zone with A Stop at Willoughby. And The Swimmer, as you follow this, if that story isn't already surreal enough, the idea of swimming across swimming pools, the way they create a movie out of that, like all the great cult films, it was a flop in its day. It had some interesting reviews, but like all great cult films and all great works of art, they're sometimes not welcomed or are a success when they come out. Many of our greatest works of art became great works of art many, many years, decades, hundreds of years later. Moby Dick, I think Malcolm Gladwell writes about this in Outliers. Moby Dick is considered the great American novel. Well, Herman Melville, who wrote it, he died unknown, a pauper. His books were forgotten. I think he died in 1850 or something like that. Or no, he died later, but he did Moby Dick, and then he did a book called Omu, I think. And that was it. And then he died, and he was forgotten for decades until 1925. A student at Yale in their literary society is going through his grandmother's attic and discovers this dusty copy of a novel called Moby Dick. He had never heard of it, right? And he was a literary club member. He reads it. He loves it. He shares it with his book club. It's Yale. So within a generation, Moby Dick becomes the great American novel. And that's sometimes how works of art are. But
the movie It's a Wonderful Life was not a hit. It kind of got forgotten.
Yeah. By the way, exactly. It had a second life on television.
Yeah, once the license died.
I remember seeing it as a kid on television, just like I saw The Swimmer on television when I was a teenager, late one night on one of the local New York stations. But that's, again, how art operates sometimes. So I connect Willoughby with the story of The Swimmer and what's revealed about him as we go on this journey with him. And by the time we get to the ending of The Swimmer, and we talked about great movie endings, Rosebud and, Planet of the Apes, the ending of The Swimmer, I believe, is another of the great movie endings of 1968. And you've got to see it to believe it. So in my screening in New York City, I'll be introducing first A Stop at Willoughby. And then in between Willoughby and The Swimmer, I'll explain the connection between the two. So when you watch The Swimmer, I'm basically positing that the swimmer is what would have happened to the character from Willoughby had he not jumped off the train and killed himself. Had he gone home to a wife who had deserted him, to the loss of his job, his income, to the loss, of his livelihood, he probably might have cracked up and wound up in a mental institution. And maybe he escapes in his swim trunks, which is how the movie and the short story, The Swimmer, begins, where he comes out of the woods in his swim trunks and begins swimming across his neighbor's pools. So that is the way I connect the two. And of course, after the screening, I'll be signing copies of my book. It's a beautiful little cabaret-sized theater on the Upper West Side in New York City. So it's a Thursday night, January 30th. And I hope everybody in the New York area can come to that.
Good deal. And you have information on your website, arlenschumer.com?
Yeah, there's an events blog page that you click on with all of my events. And I always have, all the descriptions and the URL links that you'll need.
Oh, well, check it out. Should be a good one for sure. Well, you want to look at some of your visuals? Let's see. Let's show the audience here at the stage. Here is your book, The 5 Themes of the Twilight Zone. Essays by Arlen.
I'm very proud of my graphic design. I love that cover.
Yeah, it's a great cover. Very loyal too. But here you have, of course, use your table of contents and
so in a sense, the 5 themes are like the 5 chapters of the book, and I repeat the television motif just on the 5 chapter pages with a little description, of why this theme, and then I list all the episodes that I believe are reflections of that theme.
He took from Forbidden Planet in several ways. That's the Forbidden Planet ship there.
So the Twilight Zone was shot on the MGM stage, and MGM did Forbidden Planet in 1956. So the Twilight Zone production people were able to get access to things like the spaceship, which they used in multiple episodes of the show, and various costumes and props. All came out of Forbidden Planet. Yeah.
And Robbie, which I mentioned before, they screwed up. Put a tin can in his head.
In the Uncle Simon episode. But you see, the Twilight Zone, again, was about the dimension of imagination. Whenever the Twilight Zone did monsters like the Outer Limits would do and things like that, they came off cheap looking and hokey. The Great Nightmare at 20,000 Feet with William Shatner. Richard Matheson hated the furry gremlin on the wing.
It was pretty hokey.
And when he bent down, you could see the soles of his plastic feet. And that's why he remade the episode with Spielberg, in 1983 with John Lithgow, with a better gremlin. But, people still love that gremlin, but Matheson hated it. The other Matheson episode called The Invaders with Agnes Moorehead, with the all the little Michelin men. Puffy suited little, troll characters. And they turn out to be Earthmen, of course. Spoiler alert, right? But, Matheson hated those as well. And that's why he remade that episode as one of the trilogy of terror TV movies with Karen Black in 1972 with a Zuni hunting fetish. You know that episode?
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's Matheson rewriting The Invaders because he hated the little. So my point is the best episodes worked in your imagination, not in a physical manifestation. The greatest time travel episode, Walking Distance, is about a man, another one of Serling's doppelgangers, another harried ad exec who can't take the rat race anymore. And he walks back into his hometown 25 years earlier. There's no special effects. The screen doesn't go, woo. No, he literally walks back in time. But the way the director films it creatively, he shoots it in a mirror in a gas station cigarette machine. So as the character walks away, we see his reflection in the mirror walking away, and the director zooms his camera into the mirror. That's called creative filmmaking. It's not cheap special effects. And by and large, the greatest Twilight Zone episodes did that. It worked on your imagination.
Yeah, they have to.
The Outer Limits was the monster of the week. I mean, they're laughable. I don't know how you can take some of those episodes seriously. But, you know, everything has its fans. But I maintain The Outer Limits was influenced by the Twilight Zone. It had some okay episodes. But again, they were all padded, in my opinion. Okay, Urban Nightmares. Again, I talk about Serling's acute ability to identify both primal and post-war American fears and crises, then build stories around them set in commonplace surroundings, a psycho-American Gothic of sorts, is perhaps the single factor most responsible for the success and longevity of the Twilight Zone. Would you agree with that, fellows?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And
you set episodes in average American surroundings, being locked in a department store at night. You know, I grew up in the land of shopping malls, Bergen County, New Jersey. And shopping malls, when I was a kid, were our theme parks. And the thought of being locked in one of them at night alone was like a nightmare as a child. And yet Serling wrote one of the greatest episodes about that, with the great Anne Francis from Forbidden Planet, as the woman who turns out, spoiler alert, to be a mannequin come to life. But, you know, that's what I call a suburban nightmare. Picking up a hitchhiker that you think is Mr. Death, American Nightmare. In a bus station, in an average, you know, the episode with the bus station called Mirror Image. It's almost like an Edward Hopper painting come to life. If you know his paintings that have human beings in them, they're like these shadowy, vague figures in this stark Americana of a bus station. And that's the way this episode comes across. And that's what a suburban nightmare is. So I think there are 10 episodes that I singled out as the 10 greatest suburban nightmares.
Yeah, like you said, so many creators, artists did it, from Stephen King, even the hit show Stranger Things, straight out of Nightmare.
Well, like I said, you know, they all do it their own way, and you know, I give Stranger Things its kudos. But like I said, I think if you talk to the creators of Stranger Things and you bring up the Twilight Zone, I guarantee you, or I would lay money, you know, with good odds, that they're going to talk about the Twilight Zone episodes that they love, that influence them.
Exactly.
And that is and you know what? I give credit to the marathons that have kept the show alive. The fact that it's available on DVD and Blu-ray. And the fact that people still talk about it is, again, what's great about it. A question of identity. I'll quote the great writer Jonathan Lethem, who said what Serling created above all else was a homegrown vernacular of alienation, identity slippage, and paranoia. And he did it right when it needed most doing, when his audience was starved for a vocabulary to express their uneasiness. And he did it on weekly television. So again, some of the most existential, philosophical, psychological episodes about the Twilight Zone are about these radical reality adjustments of our very identity. A man wakes up and his wife doesn't know who he is. His coworkers don't know who he is. He knows who he is. Remember the CeeLo Green song, Crazy?
Yeah.
I love that song. And if you really analyze the lyrics, it's about what happens when you know you're not crazy, but everybody thinks you're crazy. And I think we all go through that sometime in our lives where we know who we are, but nobody else knows who we are. And that's a very basic human existential, again, we could be talking about it all day long. But the episodes represent the most episodes in the book. I think there are 18 episodes in A Question of Identity, because so many of the greatest ones that we talked about, the actor who thinks, the businessman and the actor, and which is the real identity, turning out that you're a mannequin come to life, the dummies that come to life, the robot who is treated like a human. All these basic questions of what it means to be human, what it means to have an identity. That's, again, one of the greatest themes of the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, he was in Hoboken, that robot.
What?
The Hoboken Zephyrs, right?
Again, not one of my favorite episodes. That definitely is not in my book, but somewhere somebody loves that episode. The Mighty Casey, it's called. Serling in real life was supposedly a great joke man. He made people laugh. He had a great wit. But in my opinion, whenever he tried comedy on the Twilight Zone, some of the more lighter-hearted episodes, they fell flat. I don't think I include any of them in my book.
Well, let's go to Obsolete Man. Why is man obsolete?
Yes. I'm a human being. I exist. And if I speak one thought aloud, that thought lives. And that's from the episode called The Obsolete Man. Burgess Meredith's other great Twilight Zone episode. That's him in the little image there. But I write here, many of the themes Serling would later clothe in fantasy and illusion in the Twilight Zone were first explored in his 1950s teleplays. His most recurring theme, alienation of the individual through bigotry, racism, and corporate and technological oppression, was that of the obsolete man. The man standing up against the state. The man standing up for his principles against all opposition. Serling and the other writers wrote so many great episodes, or at least the 9 that I choose here are the greatest examples of Serling and the other writers' episodes about the individual against insurmountable odds and how he either triumphs or fails. And even in the failure, as with all failure, there are the seeds of victory in a way. The Matheson episode Steel with Lee Marvin as a boxer in the future, a manager of a robotic boxer, but because the robot breaks down, he's got to basically go into the ring, making believe he's a robot, fighting against a real robot. And of course, in 30 seconds, he gets the shit beaten out of him. But even while he's lying there in a pietà-like position with his partner cradling him, he basically says the show must go on. That even though he's beaten and bloodied with a mouthful of bloody, broken teeth, his will, his spirit will get up and fight another day. So that's just one of the great episodes in Obsolete Man.
There you go. Yeah, when you've got alienation, false realities, anxiety, all that, you're definitely into Gnostic themes. If you're close to Kafka, you're into Gnostic themes because Kafka was very influenced by Gnosticism.
Well, listen, how do you define Gnosticism? Secret knowledge, right? Esoteric knowledge.
Yeah, gnosis. Yeah.
Only known to the initiates. And listen, that was the great schism in early Christianity, right? Between the Gnostics, the ones who believed Jesus gave us a whole secret special knowledge and that God was within, etc. That's the whole other thing. But yeah, so, I don't know if I've described the Twilight Zone in that way, but through these great stories, you can, quote, teach people knowledge about life, knowledge about how to live it, knowledge about what to do morally, ethically. It's the knowledge of life, really. whether it's secret or not, people don't know sometimes that, the simple answers to their problems are right in front of them, but they can't see it. And I think one of the job of artists, we're not possessors of secret knowledge. We're possessors of what makes life worth living, which is about taking time out to stop and smell the roses. And by getting people to read something, see something, learn something, you can call it secret knowledge or art, whatever. But as long as it gets them to look at their life a little differently, a little freshly, in a new way that is a glass half full versus half empty kind of view.
Well said indeed.
Oh, so the time element. We haven't even talked about the time element. A quote from an episode not written by Serling. Clocks are made by men. God creates time.
Mm.
So I write here that the title of this theme references that of the de facto pilot episode of The Twilight Zone, Serling's 1-hour script for Desilu Playhouse in 1958 called The Time Element, whose success would birth Serling's brainchild. The time element itself would prove to be one of the conceptual cornerstones of The Twilight Zone, a dimension Serling described to be as timeless as infinity. Now, there are 14 episodes I chose there. Obviously, the time element, there are many more episodes about time that I did not choose, but the ones I chose, interesting that I think 12 of them are Serling originals. So he was, for a young man who had gone through war like his generation did, his conception of time changed, and he had a very fatalistic view. He knew that his father had died at 53 and Serling would die at 50. So many of his greatest Twilight Zone episodes reflect not only wanting to go back in time, like that episode Walking Distance, but just the idea of episodes that take place in other time periods that are nevertheless reflective of our modern situations, which is the whole point of any time travel story, I think, is to reflect our own time through the past or the future. So it's interesting that I ended up choosing, like I said, 12 or 13 out of the 14 episodes are Serling. And it's not that Matheson and Beaumont and the others didn't write episodes that had to do with time, but hey, these are my choices. So, to all those fans of The Twilight Zone who are fans of the episodes I did not write about, I'm kind of throwing down the gauntlet and basically saying, I believe as a true fan and historian of The Twilight Zone, these are the episodes that belong in the canon. Not all episodes belong there because you don't always hit a home run. Now, if you want to say, well, what about The Hunt? What about this episode? What about that episode? My answer is write your own book, write your own essays. And if they do that, we will create discussion about what makes a great Twilight Zone episode. Why is this episode considered, quote, better than this episode? We just had the Academy Awards, the Golden Globes. I don't like award shows. How do you claim one movie or one performance is better than another movie? They're completely different things. But within the genre of The Twilight Zone, I've thrown down the gauntlet for history by publishing this book and basically saying, these are the episodes that I'm giving to the aliens. I'm not going to burden their spaceship. Well, they don't have room, they said, with the other, 80 episodes I did not include. But hey, knock yourself out. You want to tell me why The Hunt belongs in my 68? I'm all ears.
I might have to make that argument. Yes.
Yeah. I'm throwing down the gauntlet.
All right. Sounds good. That's how we get places.
That's one of that might be my single favorite double-page spread in my book. I designed my book. I have a graphic design background from Rhode Island School of Design. Mm-hmm. So the couple of books I've published, I've also designed. And this is just an incredible photograph from one of the great science and superstition episodes called The Grave. And that is not a real location, even though it looks like they're on location. That is a set with a backdrop, and that's what makes the Twilight Zone great. They were like incredible Broadway plays shot for television. And some of the greatest episodes have some of the most creative set design. I mean, that's a cemetery in the Old West. And it's just one of the greatest cemetery sets just ever designed. And to be able to take this panoramic shot and design it as a double-page spread in which I discuss in my text that the set becomes the real star of the episode.
It's wonderful. All right. And
so this is an example of placing the Twilight Zone in between the surrealism that preceded it and the modern art and popular culture that came after it. So this is an episode called The Jungle, about a man in the end of the episode who comes home to find a lion in his bedroom having just devoured his wife and jumps on him. And that's, of course, the end of the episode. But the idea of a lion in your bedroom, which is the key image from the show, on the left is Magritte, the great surrealist painter of the 20th century. And that's from, I think, 1949, maybe. He did a series of images of lions in basic, plain, domestic settings like a dining room. The image on the right is from 1983, and that's from the great children's book illustrator Chris Van Allsburg, who teaches at RISD, by the way. And that's his children's book called Jumanji. Yes, that Jumanji that they made like 5 movies out of already. But the original book is beautiful black and white pencil illustrations of domestic animals all of a sudden appearing in a suburban home when the kids play the game. So I believe that Chris Van Allsburg, baby boomer, I interviewed him for my book, my original book, and he talked about the influence of the Twilight Zone. Maybe not specifically, but in a general sense. And there you have it, that the Twilight Zone is in between surrealism that preceded it and modern art and pop culture that followed it.
very cool.
Third from the Sun is a Matheson episode that Serling adapted. It was Matheson's first appearance on the Twilight Zone as just the source of the short story that I show here in the graphic in a paperback book that Serling probably had read and loved. And that's why he chose to adapt the story. In the upper right corner is a cartoon I found from that time period, 1962. And the caption reads, "The U.S. and Russia may be running neck and neck in space, but Rod Serling in 2 years is 2 years ahead of them both." Now, this is a cartoon that ran at the time because Third from the Sun, which appears in January of 1960, is about the looming threat of nuclear war hanging over the heads as the bombs are about to drop. And this is the greatest fear of the post-war age, was living under the sword of Damocles of the atom bomb in Russia and all of that. Serling writes this episode adapted from the Matheson short story from years earlier, and yet it predates the Cuban Missile Crisis, by almost 2 years. And that is how Serling was prescient. When you watch this episode, this is what people were going through in 1962 in October, is exactly what these characters are going through. So that's just one tiny example of how prescient the episodes were. So many of them.
For sure.
This might be my single favorite double page spread. That's from the episode 22, which was the number of the hospital morgue.
Yeah.
That our female protagonist dreams, or she thinks it's real, but it's a recurring nightmare where she's led down to the morgue, and out comes this incredible looking nurse with a line.
Spock's wife, by the way.
What?
Spock's wife.
Yes, so that is Arlen Martell, billed originally as Arlen Sachs, I guess her maiden name. But she looks so not of this time, not of this world. She has an exotic look that really makes her timeless. I describe her as almost like the angel of death. She's both beautiful and repellent at the same time, which is a line pretty hard to pull off.
Yeah.
But this is an example, graphic design-wise, of what I call a happy accident. I had no idea when I designed this double-page spread that it was going to come out this way, which looks so perfectly in tune with the image itself. Notice how the right-hand page, the margin on the left follows the hospital door line. And if you look at her eyes on the left-hand page, the line of text that goes right across her eyeball says, "A true angel of death."
Yeah.
And it's right at her eye line. Now, I didn't plan that out. All I knew was that I love this image. And when I always looked at it, I said, that would make a great double-page spread because of the way it's composed. So when I ended up designing it on the computer in Photoshop and I blew it up, I was like, oh my God, the text just winds up right at her eyeball. And the right-hand page just lines up perfectly with that door. I mean, this is what we call happy accidents. So it came from an inspiration, but I never would have thought it would have been so perfect. But that's why it's one of my favorite double-page spreads.
It's wonderful.
And by the way, the idea of ghosting an image behind the text, as it's called in the graphic design world, when you take an image and you fade it, you quote ghost it, so that you can still read the black lettering of the text, but you sense this image behind it as you're reading it. Mm-hmm. Well, I repeat this ghosting motif throughout the book, and it makes perfect sense for the medium of the genre of the essays themselves, which are quite ghostly and eerie, the Twilight Zone. So the idea of ghosting an image for a book about the Twilight Zone makes perfect sense graphically.
It does.
The Masks, another great mask episode, designed by the great master of the Twilight Zone, William Tuttle, one of the great makeup men of all time. He designed both the Eye of the Beholder pig faces and these masks that were supposedly made in the story by a Cajun wise man, a shaman type character. And it supposedly reflected the opposite of what you were inside. But of course, it reflected what was really inside of these horrible people who came to, quote, mourn their patriarch in a wheelchair about to die just to get his money. And he gives them their money on the one condition that they wear these masks until midnight on Mardi Gras. And if they don't, they won't get a penny. So, of course, they all agree to wear the mask. It's the husband, the wife, and the two kids that are, adult age kids. And you can see these masks that Tuttle designed. When they are taken off at the end, he made up their faces to look like the masks themselves. And it's directed by Ida Lupino, one of the great actresses of the 20th century. And Serling, again, ahead of his time. There weren't many women directing television episodes back then. And, Ida Lupino directed The Masks. She was also in a Twilight Zone episode. It's not one in my book, but it was like the 4th episode called the 16mm Shrine. So
I remember that one.
Distinction in the Twilight Zone to have acted in it and directed an episode. But yeah, people remember The Masks because of the way nothing looked like the Twilight Zone. There's the Burgess Meredith episode. And there's the director, John Bram, who came out of German expressionist movies from the 40s, very film noir. And he directed, I think, a dozen Twilight Zone episodes, 7 of which I think are in my book. He directed so many great classics, like Time Enough at Last, Mirror Image is one of his. Person or Persons Unknown, one of the great identity episodes written by Beaumont about the man that wakes up and his wife doesn't know who he is. So yeah, there he is next to Burgess Meredith. That's another one of the great sets. That, folks, is a backdrop, and yet it looks like it goes on forever to a vanishing point. That was the first time the post-apocalyptic bomb drop was fictionalized for television, when that episode aired in 1959. And it's just one of the greatest set designs, not only in television history, I'd say in all filmed mediums. The stage design, just like for that other episode, the grave, the Western panorama, the time enough at last, and the library steps with the books is a timeless set, pun intended. Another one of my favorite ghosted spreads, Willoughby, when he steps off the train at the end. In reality, he's stepping off the train to his death. But Willoughby represents his escape from the pressures of the modern world. And again, there's a bit of accidental design that the way I designed the type, I quote Serling's last interview before he died. If I had the means, I think I would like to be in Victorian times, small town, bandstands, summer. And that's what Willoughby was. And then I quote David Byrne in the Talking Heads, once in a lifetime. And you may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife. And you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? And you may tell yourself, this is not my beautiful house. And you may tell yourself, this is not my beautiful wife. That's what the Garth Williams character, Serling's doppelganger, goes through when he gives up all the trappings of his materialist life. That Serling, again, as a visionary, was projecting exactly what the counterculture would rebuke the establishment for. Some people aren't built for competition, or rich communities they don't feel comfortable in, or country clubs they wear around their neck like a badge of status. Anyway, the original title for Eye of the Beholder, The Private World of Darkness. And there's Serling in a production photo with the actress playing Janet Tyler on her 11th plastic surgery. We don't know what she looks like, but she must be horribly ugly. Right?
Right.
Yeah, this episode, again, might be the single greatest episode, only because of the audaciousness of not showing the doctors or nurses throughout the episode. They're always in shadows or they're shot from behind. If you already know the Twilight Zone shtick, you come to this episode, especially as a newbie, a teenager maybe, they can kind of predict the ending. But that's not the way to judge this episode. You have to really judge it as it was initially presented in 1960 to a relatively new Twilight Zone audience that wasn't yet that used to the Twilight Zone that they could predict ahead. But just in the idea of creatively trying to pull that off, you got to give this episode a lot of credit for the cojones. And then the reveal of the pig faces is just the way the Twilight Zone ran that line, very thin, between horror and humor, which is a very difficult line to ride. You know, modern special effects with monsters are all drippy and gooey, like the Alien, Predator, all that stuff. Not the Twilight Zone. When you see those pig faces, many people's first response is to giggle, is to laugh, because there's a humorous element. The pug nose, the big curled upper lip. But at the same time, they're horrible looking. They're grotesque. They're repellent. Kind of like the Angel of Death. She's both beautiful and horrible at the same time. Mm-hmm. That is a very difficult creative line to tiptoe. And the Twilight Zone in this episode ride that line That's why whenever you come to this episode, at whatever age you are, those pig faces, the first time you see them, lodge their way into your brain forever.
It did for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Serling, nice Jewish boy, born on Christmas Day. Last year was his centennial. And, I said he wanted to be remembered as a writer. Most critics would say he was one of the greatest television writers of the 20th century. But I would go further and say, if you look at the influence of the Twilight Zone on so many people over time, I'd consider Serling not just a great television writer of the 20th century, but he should be considered one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century who worked in television, which is different than kind of the somewhat belittling great television writer. In the same way Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize for literature, Serling, though working in television, should be honored, and I honor him that way, as one of the great American writers of the 20th century.
I think you make a good case, and I would have to agree. And his contributions are timeless and will go on forever.
Exactly.
Until, we reboot the civilization.
Well, somewhere under the atomic rubble.
Yes, exactly.
I hope they'll find a copy of my book.
Be your hand of the
right. Yeah.
Oh, well, this has been great. I've really enjoyed it. But yeah, we probably should wrap it up. Vince, do you have any last questions or remarks for Arlen?
Yeah. What do you have to say about the pacing? One thing I noticed about and maybe it's me because of all the years I've been watching the action movies, the pacing seems slow by today's standards, and you have to kind of ease yourself into it and force yourself to watch the cinematography and the artistry that they use to create the episode. But what have you say about that?
Okay, so I think I said earlier that what's great about these episodes is that they're the exact opposite of what you're saying. They're such terse. Talk about brevity being the art of wit, or whatever the expression is. The amount of flotsam and jetsam that does not exist for these episodes, they suck you in immediately. Now, if you're talking about the pacing of things, well, yeah, in today's world of media with what they call the explosion movies, every 5 minutes there's an explosion, which is just a metaphor for the idea of today's medium, which is quick cutting, right? Every video you see, they don't let your eyes rest for more than 2 seconds. You're on to something else. No, the Twilight Zone is not like that. But I believe that the best episodes are primers on a tight, pungent, meaningful, no extraneous crap, no scenes that, again, the 1 hour episodes are padded. People are talking and talking and talking. Not these great Twilight Zone episodes, at least the ones I selected. Again, they suck you in right from the beginning. That episode about the morgue, it opens up with her waking up in her hospital bed and following the nurse down to the morgue. You're right there with her in her dream, right from the get-go. There's no slow pacing. It's
they repeat it, though. They repeat that same sequence, so they doubled that sequence.
Well, now in my essay for that episode, I address that issue, and I say that, yes, but she repeated the same scene slightly differently. And it's a subtle form of acting where you have to do, it's like a Broadway actor. Every night you have to do the same performance, but you make it a little bit different each time to keep it fresh. That is what great actors do. And I believe that Barbara Nichols, the actress in that episode, is unfairly maligned. I believe when you really look at the 3 morgue trips, each one of them is slightly different.
Yeah.
And that's what makes them work.
Okay, I'll give you that. Yeah.
Well, again, this is what I tell people. Watch the episodes in the order I put them in my book. Watch them first, fresh. They're on Paramount Plus, streaming, Pluto TV, or buy the DVDs or Blu-rays. You won't regret it. Watch the episode first fresh, form your own opinion, and then read my essay about that episode. And if I've done my job, which I think I have, I'll make even the most diehard Twilight Zone fan see something, feel something, learn something about that episode that they did not see or hear or think or feel before. But that's my gauntlet that I'm throwing down. And that episode is a perfect example. I know it's one of my favorite. Some people, it's their worst. So again, how does an art historian or critic deal with an episode that is both loved and hated by the fan base? I happen to love it, but I'd like to think in my essay, I justify that love. What did Madonna sing? Justify my love. The whole job of a critic or an historian, it's awesome. Art is totally subjective. So then why do we have a body called art history? Because while all art is subjective, not all art is, quote, great. Just because you like something doesn't mean it's as good as what Michelangelo or Picasso did. And that's the job of critics and historians, is to separate the wheat from the chaff and support it with reasoned analysis. And that's what academia is all about in that field. I've tried to do that with these essays, is justify them as to why I'm writing about them. What do they have to say to us? You know, what do I have to say about them? It's a two-way street.
Well said.
Fair enough.
Indeed. Yeah. And we shall continue the discussion. Yeah, for the audience, please go to arlenschumer.com for the book and other sundries, including his talks and past presentations and his book. Yeah.
This book will change your life.
Yes, definitely get the 5 themes.
I call it the Torah of the Twilight Zone. Got all the wisdom. You know, Serling, like Bob Dylan, was like an Old Testament prophet in a 20th century body. Although Dylan is still here with us, God bless, in the 21st century. But I tried to reflect the wisdom of Serling and the other writers in these episodes in my essays. And it came to me one day, I was describing the book to a friend, and I said, it's like the Torah of the Twilight Zone. It just came to me in a paranormal flash.
Hey, it's got Adam and Eve, with Richard Basehart playing Adam. So
yeah,
right.
You name me all the episodes that are not in my book, Vance.
I don't know what it is.
How about naming an episode that's actually in my book?
I'll have to get your book first, I guess. So I know.
See, but Miguel, this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. A fan like Vance can name the episodes that are not even in my book.
Right.
Well, what does that tell you? You name The Hunt as your favorite episode. That's not in my book. And yet people love it. So, again.
Well, it's all so personal how we affected it. And it's our background where we...
I didn't grow up with a pet. I grew up in a garden apartment. I didn't grow up with a dog or a cat. So, yeah, the reason why people love The Hunt, it's the essence of why they love their pets, especially their dogs.
Yeah, from a Christian background.
I mean, listen,
heaven and hell.
if somebody were paying me to say, Arlen, I want you to do a book and you write about all 156 episodes, even the ones you don't like. But how much are you paying me? Really? Okay, I'll do it. I could write an essay about The Hunt if I had to. But you see, it didn't attach me emotionally. I watched it multiple times. I understand why people love it. But again, I only chose to write about the episodes that meant something to me. And I think everybody has their, quote, favorite episodes. I don't think there's anybody, and I don't think it's possible to love all 156 episodes equally. I think look, there are Beatles songs Beatle fans don't like. I'm a Bruce Springsteen fan. But there are songs that I have never listened to after the first time I put it on the turntable, back in the days of turntables. But that's the nature of art.
Wait a second, there's a Beatle fan doesn't like a Beatles song? That's impossible.
There are Beatles fans that don't like Mr. Moonlight.
Really? Okay,
I call that their bar mitzvah song. He came to me one summer night. I mean,
Okay, maybe have a yeah.
but again,
Revolution
I'm
number
sure
9 with Yoko.
I'm sure there are Beatle fans that love that song.
Yeah.
Listen, I don't like fixing a hole. Okay, sue me. When that comes on in the Sgt. Pepper thing, I skip. I don't like it. Okay. Again, sue me.
It's your book. Nobody wants you to write about stuff you don't want to write.
No, but my point is, most books about episodic subjects,
and they go.
They write about every episode because it always has to be complete. Again, I'm throwing down a gauntlet by saying no. The Twilight Zone is a body of work, just like most. We're talking about Bob Dylan. The guy's had a bunch of dud albums that even his greatest fans call duds. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure there are fans of Dylan that like some of those songs, and I'm sure they debate about it as Dylanologists debate about everything. Mm-hmm. But that's the nature of the beast. That's why we have discussion groups and social media, is to discuss these things. And, again, the democracy of social media is that even the worst pieces of shit have Facebook groups devoted to them. But shit is in the eye of the beholder. You like how I wrap that all up in a bow there?
Yeah, no, makes perfect sense. Awesome. Well, we're at the end. Good comments and quotes with the audience. And I'd like to say, Vance, thanks for keeping us company in this.
Oh, you bet.
Hey,
back in the Twilight Zone.
Thanks for having me on. Anytime you want to talk about Twilight Zone, comic book history, Bruce Springsteen.
Let's do it. Love to talk to you about comic book history. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be available. This has been fabulous. Thanks.
All right. For everybody else, thanks for being here. Get Arlen's book. Enjoy the rest of your night, and we will see you soon. Yes. On the show notes for sure. And yeah, everybody, as I say, write your own gospel, live your own myth. Take care, everybody. Take care, everybody.
Happy New Year.